Hey folks, Brian Keeney with OCCAM Defense, back for episode 2 of Astigmatism, red dots, peep sights, and all that. Let's get into the solution. In part 1, we covered what happens when a lens is lumpy. I'm not going to go through what this thing is. If you don't know what it is, definitely watch episode 1. But briefly, when light hits a lump on our lens that's come from an injury or just natural aging, maybe your lens looks like a football now instead of what it should look like, that kind of thing. Uh, Light that hits that lump is not going to focus properly. It's going to get kicked off at a weird angle, kind of like a bullet when it hits a twig or something. I left you with this question of how do we fix it? And also with a hint. And that hint is sometimes called a pinhole camera. Sometimes it's called a peep sight. Sometimes it's called the f-stop on a photography camera. To get a deeper depth of focus, you can crank up the f-stop, which closes a collimator, lets in less light, but it gives you a sharper image over a greater distance. So let's look at how this would work. With our black track that's going straight through the lens, there's no change. It just continues on its merry way. Life is good. The blue case where we have the lump, the photon light particle is coming in and it hits the collimator or the peep. If I say aperture, peep, collimator, hole, those are all the same thing. So great, we don't have that weird starburst anymore. We've kind of solved the problem. We look at the red track and it doesn't get there anymore because it's hitting the collimator. So that brings us to the first rule of physics. You might think I was going to say something about Newton, and there's actually a more fundamental, cynical aspect of physicists, and it's that we believe there is no free lunch ever. So we won something. We got rid of that starburst, but we paid for it. So we won focus. That's really cool. But we had to pay for it with intensity, which is kind of the same thing as brightness. So that's a real thing. We got, in this particular example, only 1 out of the 3 tracks made it to our eyeball. So this is very much, yeah, it's a real thing. Luckily, on a red dot, we can control brightness. We've got a volume knob there. With our shooting conditions, that's the thing we can't control unless we have some incredibly bright light. And so this technique works great during the day, but it's going to work variably as you approach dusk. Let's get into practical applications of this. So here is a setup with your eyeball, your red dot, and a peep sight. And in this case, we're leaving the diameter of the hole the same, and we're moving it back and forth. And and some setup stuff. This isn't incredibly precise, but I kept the angle the same for the 2 incident beams. So these are pretty equivalent. And we see that when we move the aperture closer to the red dot, this is hard to see, but more light does get through in terms of brightness to your eye. But it's scattered over a bigger distance, and which is okay. In a perfect eye, it'll all get refocused back to where it needs to be. But in somebody with astigmatism, you have a greater likelihood of exciting that part of the lens that's lumpy and getting some starburst action. So I had this great mentor that taught me violin making. He was also a physicist, great man. And he was opining on the philosophy of physics for one day when we were making violins. And he said, our job as physicists is to find a volume knob in nature and to crank it all the way to 11 and then crank it all the way back to 0 and see what happens. And then start moving it back and forth and playing with it. And then once we get kind of an intuition for what it's going to do, we start moving that volume knob incredibly slowly and taking a lot of measurements so that we can precisely track what's happening. This is what we're doing right now. I'm showing you keep the aperture the same and now move it back and forth. So case 1, We got more light to the eye, but we have more astigmatism. Case 2, you put it all the way to your eye. You're going to get less light, but you're going to have a much sharper image. So that's one knob in nature. You can move the relative position of the peep and your red dot. So when you're at the range or pointed in a safe direction with the safe gun, you can try different combinations. Try putting your red dot farther forward. Try putting your peep further back. Play around with it. There are some situations where if you're young, where putting the peep in front of the red dot makes sense. So play around. I often say, I don't really care how you set up your gun, like for zeroing and all this stuff. I want it to work for you. And so as long as you have the tools to figure out what best for you is, then I've done my job. Let's try the other case where we keep the position of the diopter aperture hole the same, but we change its diameter, the opening size of the hole. So in case 1, we've got a fairly large opening and we are getting a lot of intensity. We're getting a lot of brightness. So this could be a good solution for around dusk, where you're getting enough information at your eye to see the sight picture downrange, but you're also probably not getting as much benefit for astigmatism because you might be illuminating the lump that's causing the problem. Case 2 is we neck that aperture way down and we get less light at our eyeball, but we get less astigmatism. So, or less of the effect of astigmatism. So there's your 2 volume knobs, assuming that you can change your peep location and your peep diameter. Shameless plug for our products. We make a set of peep sights called the PH2 that's down at the bottom, and we give you a volume knob on there. We give you a notch that's at far right there for when you don't even need a peep. You know, there's times where your target information is more important than how tight the dot is. Like if you're in law enforcement or a civilian defender and there's a bad guy and you're drawing down on him and you're trying to figure out shoot, no shoot situations, being able to see what's in that guy's hands or what they're doing is really important. And so clogging up your sight picture with an aperture when the shot is easy but you don't know whether to shoot or not, that's a good situation where you would want that notch. If you need to make any kind of an accurate shot at all, that's where these 3 diopters get in. And you can flip them around to get the shot, to get the sight picture you want. So for me, I have to test our firearms weekly when we're shipping them. And I have moderate astigmatism, and I cannot shoot well without a tight peep. And so my setup is a 2 MOA dot with the narrowest aperture. And our targets, I use a black dot that's also 2 MOA. 2 MOA peep, or sorry, 2 MOA red dot, 2 MOA target. My target has a black circle, my dot is red. With this astigmatism correction, I can get the red dot to perfectly cover the black, and I can shoot sub MOA every week of the year, rain, sleet, snow, sun. It's a really big deal. Thank you very much for watching. If this was useful to you, please share it with a friend. This has a monster impact for older folks, you know, over 30, in having them be able to keep enjoying shooting with the red dot. A lot of folks think they can't anymore, and that's just not so. Thank you very much for your attention. Our sites are available at OCCAMDefense.com, Instagram, OCCAM Defense Solutions, videos on Rumble, YouTube, and others.